My dear literature enthusiasts, welcome back. It always feels like coming home when we gather like this, when we set aside the noise of daily life and sink into a deeper, quieter exploration of story, theme, and the haunting beauty that movies can leave behind in us. Before we dive in, I'd love to gently remind you to like and subscribe, not as a transaction, but as an invitation to keep this circle of thoughtful conversation alive. If you enjoy taking apart films the way some people savor poetry, then this space is yours. And just to be clear from the outset, what follows is not a review of an actual film, but a purely theoretical and critical exploration, something closer to a literary thought experiment than a consumer's guide. This is for education, for intellectual curiosity, and hopefully for the joy of sharing ideas with others who crave depth. With that said, let's step together into the imagined world of Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025. I have to admit, there's something uncanny about returning to a franchise that was so much a part of my adolescence. I remember the first time I saw one of these films late at night, the television glowing in the dark, my teenage mind caught between the thrill of spectacle and the sobering undercurrent of mortality. It wasn't just the jump scares or elaborate sequences of fate at work. It was the philosophy of inevitability that lingered long after the credits rolled. Watching, I felt like I had stumbled into a cinematic version of a Greek tragedy, where fate and hubris entwined in a dance that left no one unscathed. That memory is what makes this new chapter, this theoretical chapter, so fascinating for me. It's as though I am revisiting old fears, old fascinations, but with the eyes of someone who has since read Sophocles, studied existentialism, and wrestled with the beauty and brutality of life itself. The film, as I imagine it, opens not with a scream, not with an explosion, but with something deceptively ordinary, a family reunion. The sense of togetherness is palpable, but so is the quiet unease beneath it. The camera lingers on faces, on small gestures, the awkward hug between estranged cousins, the too bright smile of an uncle who has seen better days. This grounding in domesticity is deliberate, I think. It asks us to recognize ourselves in the everyday before tearing that fabric apart. And then comes the incident, the inevitable disaster. It's staged with the same meticulous choreography that has defined the franchise. An accident so intricate it feels less like chaos and more like clockwork. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but think of how life itself often delivers its most devastating blows in ways that feel both random and eerily precise. What follows is the familiar pattern. A survivor, or rather a group of them, begins to sense that they were not spared by luck but marked by something larger, something unseen. Yet in this version, there's a twist that makes the narrative pulse with new life. Instead of focusing solely on the mechanics of death's design, the story threads itself into the history of the family itself. The bloodlines that carry not only genetic markers but, metaphorically, the shadows of fate. I find this deeply compelling because it reflects something I've often wondered in my own quiet moments. How much of our destiny is inherited? Are we not only the sum of our choices, but also the echo of choices made by those before us? The plot teases us with these questions while never forgetting to keep our hearts racing. There's a particular sequence that still lingers in my mind, where one character, convinced they've broken the chain, sits alone in a library, surrounded by old documents and genealogical records. The silence builds, the air itself seems heavy, and then something shifts. A faint noise, a book sliding from a shelf without reason, a breath caught in the throat of the viewer. It's not the spectacle here that terrifies, but the suggestion that knowledge itself can be a harbinger of doom. For me, that scene resonated on a deeply personal level. I remember studying late nights in the library as a graduate student, feeling the weight of generations of thought pressing down from the shelves. The idea that history, our bloodlines, our intellectual inheritances, could both save and damn us struck me as painfully true. As the story unfolds, we are pulled deeper into the web of inevitability. Relationships fracture under the pressure, but they also reveal unexpected tenderness. One of the cousins, for instance, takes on a protective role toward a younger sibling, and in those quiet moments of whispered promises, I found myself reflecting on my own family, on the ways we cling to one another when the world seems intent on reminding us of our fragility. This, I think, is where the film transcends its genre roots. It's not just about watching elaborate deaths, though of course those remain, each one a darkly creative set piece. It's about witnessing how people confront the knowledge of their own impermanence, and how love, however fleeting, flickers even in the shadow of inevitability. There is naturally a major twist. I won't give it all away here. I want to preserve some of the shiver that comes with discovery. But I'll say this. The story bends the rules we thought we knew. It asks us to reconsider whether fate is a straight line or a tangled web. And in doing so, it flirts with a kind of literary postmodernism, blurring the line between narrative inevitability and narrative play. It reminded me of those moments in literature where the author seems to wink at you from behind the page, reminding you that the story itself is a construct, and that fate, in fiction as in life, is always partially written by the storyteller. By the end, I was left not with the hollow thrill of adrenaline but with something quieter, heavier, and perhaps more profound. I thought about my own lineage, the stories whispered at family gatherings, the tragedies half-buried but never forgotten. I thought about the accidents I've narrowly escaped in my own life. The car that swerved but didn't hit me, the illness that resolved against the odds. Are these moments of luck, or are they reminders of a design I cannot comprehend? These are not easy questions, and the film does not answer them neatly. But maybe that's the point. Maybe art at its most haunting doesn't resolve our fears. It gives them shape, gives them a face, and then leaves us to sit with them. And so, as we close this reflection together, I want to thank you once again for joining me in this space. You fellow lovers of literature and film, make these conversations feel less like analysis and more like communion. We don't watch movies like this just to be entertained. We watch them to feel the tremor of something larger than ourselves, to be reminded that stories, whether told on a page, a stage, or a screen, are mirrors of our own fragile humanity. If this resonated with you, if you felt the tug of both dread and wonder in these musings, I hope you'll stay connected with me. Like, subscribe, share. Yes, of course, but more importantly, keep thinking, keep questioning, keep diving deep. Because in the end, it's not about the destination. It's about the journey we take together, through story after story, searching for meaning in the shadows. When I think back to the beginning of this imagined film, what strikes me most is the deceptive calm, the quiet way the story opens, as though nothing could possibly go wrong. There's a softness in that choice, a deliberate invitation to let our guard down. We're not immediately thrust into chaos, not greeted by the violent spectacle that we've come to expect. Instead, the camera lingers on faces and familiar gestures, a gathering of family members who seem to be stitched together by both love and unease. There's a reunion underway, though the air hums with awkwardness. I can almost smell the casserole dishes, hear the squeak of folding chairs set up in a suburban backyard, and feel the nervous tension of people who share a last name but not necessarily a sense of belonging. Among these figures, a few stand out. There's the eldest cousin, quietly carrying the weight of responsibility, always the one to arrive early and help with the setup. There's the younger brother, restless, eyes darting, never quite able to stay in one place. A boy who feels as though life is happening elsewhere and he's missing it. And then there's the aunt whose smile is too bright, whose laugh rings hollow, betraying old wounds that family gossip has only half hidden. The camera doesn't tell us yet what's important, but the details, the small glances, suggest that everyone here has something lingering just beneath the surface. As the afternoon unfolds, conversations drift between the mundane and the meaningful. Someone brings up old family stories, tales of great-grandparents who endured hardships, who carried both resilience and tragedy in their blood. It seems innocent enough, just small talk over plates of food, but I couldn't shake the sense that these recollections were more than filler. They felt like threads being laid down in a tapestry, clues, perhaps, to something larger, something waiting to emerge. Then it happens. The moment of rupture. The disaster that tears through the illusion of safety. It begins with the sound of laughter, children chasing each other too close to the edge of the road where the reunion is taking place. A truck rounds the corner too fast, tires screeching, metal screaming against the pavement. The camera slows time, elongates it, letting us see each fragment. The spilled drink glistening in the sun, the gasp caught in a grandmother's throat, the panicked eyes of the driver. And then impact, not with the children but with something unexpected. The truck swerves, crashes into a chain of parked cars, and a horrific chain reaction begins. Metal bends, glass shatters, objects fly in unpredictable arcs. It's brutal, precise, and inescapable, the kind of catastrophe that feels both random and fated, as though the universe itself had been waiting for this exact constellation of events. What's left behind is silence. A silence so deep it feels like it could swallow the world. Survivors stagger, dazed, hands trembling as they reach for loved ones, eyes scanning for who is missing, who is hurt. The aftermath is chaos, But in the center of it all stands one figure, a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, who seems to see something no one else does. She blinks, shakes her head, as though trying to dislodge a vision. And then it hits us. She had seen this before. Not in detail, not in sequence, but in flashes, like shards of glass catching the light. Her reaction is not just shock, it's recognition. From that moment, the tone shifts. We, the audience, are now tethered to her perspective, caught in the same unsettling space between reality and foreknowledge. She tries to explain what she felt, what she saw, but her words fall flat against the rational minds of those around her. Who would believe such a thing? Who would accept the notion that fate could be glimpsed, however briefly? And yet, when more small, seemingly insignificant accidents begin to unfold in the hours and days afterward, her unease spreads. A kettle left too long on the stove, a light bulb flickering ominously before bursting, a near miss on the road. All of it begins to weave a pattern that others can no longer ignore. One by one, survivors begin to realize that they are marked. The film doesn't rush this realization. It lingers in the in-between spaces, in the glances exchanged, in the late-night phone calls where voices tremble with fear but try to sound calm. It reminds me of how dread often works in life, not as a scream, but as a whisper that grows louder the more we try to silence it. What fascinates me most about this first stretch of the story is how it intertwines the personal with the universal. On the surface, it's about escaping an invisible force, about trying to outrun the inevitability of death. But beneath that, it's about family, the weight of history, the bonds we inherit whether we want them or not. As characters dig into the past, trying to make sense of why this is happening, they stumble upon stories of ancestors who died in strangely similar ways, patterns of misfortune that ripple across generations. These discoveries aren't presented as neat exposition but as fragments, pieced together from old letters, whispered stories, and the uncomfortable silence that falls whenever certain topics are raised. I found myself deeply moved by one scene in particular. A cousin, desperate to understand, sneaks into the attic of the family's ancestral home. Dust floats in the air like tiny ghosts, and the wooden beams creak with every step. She opens a trunk, and inside are photographs, brittle with age, showing faces that look eerily familiar. Faces that could almost be her own, or her siblings, but belonging to people long gone. Alongside the photos are newspaper clippings, each one recounting accidents, sudden deaths, tragedies that feel too precise to be coincidence. The camera lingers on her expression as she realizes that what they are experiencing is not new. It has been with them all along, passed down like a terrible inheritance. This revelation doesn't unite the survivors, it fractures them. Some want to confront it, to find a way to fight back, to break the cycle. Others retreat into denial, insisting that to believe in such patterns is to give them power. The tension between these responses becomes the beating heart of the story's first half. I couldn't help but see echoes of real life here, in how families handle trauma or illness, or even generational poverty. Some confront it head-on, others bury it beneath layers of denial. And in both cases, the struggle is not just external but deeply personal, deeply human. Of course, while these emotional threads deepen, the relentless machinery of fate continues its work. The deaths, when they come, are staged with the same terrible beauty the series is known for. But here they feel almost more intimate. One takes place in the kitchen, in a space we all know so well. The sound of a boiling pot, the slip of water on the floor, the sharp edge of something that should have been harmless. Another unfolds in the sterile brightness of a hospital, where safety seems guaranteed but where, instead, the fragility of bodies becomes heartbreakingly clear. Each time, the survivors are reminded. There is no safety, no escape, only the fragile illusion of control. And yet, despite the horror, there are moments of tenderness that stop the story from collapsing into despair. Two cousins share a quiet midnight conversation, promising to protect one another even though they both know such promises are impossible. A mother holds her child a little tighter, as though sheer willpower could keep fate at bay. These moments reminded me of my own family, of nights spent awake, listening to the breathing of those I love, fearing what the world might do to them. The film captures that paradox, how love makes us more vulnerable but also more human. By the time we reach the midpoint, the characters are no longer simply reacting. They are beginning to search. Search for answers, for loopholes, for some way to interrupt the design that seems to bind them. There's talk of skipping town, of separating to spread out the danger, of consulting people who deal in folklore and superstition. Some scoff, Others cling to these desperate ideas with the fervor of drowning souls reaching for driftwood. And beneath it all is the growing realization that perhaps the true danger is not death itself, but the fear that corrodes trust, that fractures bonds, that isolates each individual in their private terror. As I reflect on this stretch of the story, I can't help but feel how carefully it balances spectacle with substance. The elaborate accidents shock us, yes, but what lingers is the intimacy of grief, the complexity of family ties, the weight of history pressing down on the present. It's a narrative that doesn't just ask what we would do to survive, but what we inherit when survival itself becomes a family legacy. And so, as the first half draws to its uneasy pause, we're left with characters who are both terrified and determined, fractured but bound together by forces they barely understand. The sense of inevitability looms larger than ever, but so does the spark of resistance, the human instinct to fight, even when the fight seems hopeless. It's that tension between surrender and defiance that keeps me riveted, that makes me lean in, heart pounding, eager to see where the story will take them next. What stays with me most when I think about where the story drifts after that turning point is the silence between characters. It isn't the loud crashes or the elaborate accidents that haunt me, though those remain vivid in memory. It's the conversations cut short, the glances that carry the weight of words never spoken. By this stage, no one can deny what is happening anymore. The pattern has revealed itself with brutal clarity. And yet, rather than binding them closer, it begins to unravel the fragile threads of trust that had been holding the survivors together. One character, one of the cousins, decides to break away entirely. He insists that the only way to cheat what's coming is to leave, to cut ties, to vanish into anonymity. The scene where he announces this is excruciating. They're sitting in the dim light of a nearly empty diner, the neon sign outside flickering in uneven rhythms, as though fate itself is mocking them. His hands shake as he grips his coffee cup, the steam rising like ghostly breath. He says he can't keep waiting, can't keep living with the constant dread. The others plead with him to stay, to face this together, but he shakes his head. There's no anger in him, just despair masquerading as determination. When he leaves the table, the hollow sound of the bell above the diner door feels final, as though something far greater than family bonds has just been severed. It doesn't take long for his absence to echo with finality. His death, when it comes, is both understated and devastating. A rainstorm, a slick road, a sudden hydroplane. The car spins, glass shatters, and the screen lingers on the water cascading down the windshield, blurring everything into abstraction. What struck me about this scene wasn't the brutality, it was the inevitability of it, the way it unfolded not as spectacle, but as a whisper from the universe. You cannot run. The others, shaken by this, begin to realize that scattering apart will not save them. Instead, they circle back to the family's history, to the strange patterns that have haunted their bloodline. The young woman who had the vision in the beginning emerges as a reluctant leader here. She's not bold, not commanding in a traditional sense, but she carries a quiet conviction, the kind that comes from having stared into the abyss and refused to look away. She believes that if they can understand the roots of this curse, or design, or whatever force is at play, they might find a way to interrupt it. This leads them to dig deeper into the ancestral home, into archives and journals that had been left untouched for generations. One of the film's most haunting sequences unfolds in the dim light of a basement, where the survivors stumble upon a hidden chamber filled with relics of their past. Handwritten confessions, records of strange occurrences, letters never sent. It's here that the story twists sharply, revealing that theirs is not simply a family haunted by bad luck. There's a pattern, yes, but it is bound up in choices made long ago. An ancestor, it seems, had once struck a bargain, perhaps not literally but symbolically, with fate itself. The details remain ambiguous, left open to interpretation, but the implication is chilling. This isn't just randomness. It's legacy. What I love about this revelation is that it doesn't fall into the trap of explaining too much. It offers just enough to make sense of the uncanny repetition, but it leaves enough unsaid to keep the mystery alive. And that feels truer, doesn't it? In life, we rarely get complete answers. We only ever get fragments, patterns we try to stitch into meaning. The survivors argue over what this discovery means. Some believe it condemns them absolutely, that no matter what they do, they are bound by the sins of the past. Others cling to the hope that recognition itself might be a form of resistance, that by acknowledging the weight of history, they can finally step free from it. This debate becomes the emotional core of the story's later stages, and it reminded me of the philosophical arguments I used to have in college about determinism versus free will. Are we prisoners of what has come before, or do we carve out our own paths, however fragile, however small? As this debate simmers, the deaths continue. Each one grows more symbolic, more entwined with the family's personal histories. One character dies while repairing an old clock, a family heirloom passed down through generations, its gears and springs suddenly turning vicious. Another meets their end near the railroad tracks, echoing a tragedy that had taken place decades earlier. It's as though fate isn't just hunting them randomly, it's reenacting old wounds, forcing them to relive the traumas of their lineage. Watching these scenes, I couldn't help but think of the way families often repeat cycles of pain. Abuse passed down, mistakes repeated, patterns replayed across time. The film captures that truth in the language of horror, but it feels painfully familiar in a more ordinary human way. There comes a moment, though, where everything tilts. It's the kind of twist that doesn't just change the direction of the story, but redefines everything that came before. The young woman realizes that she isn't just seeing visions of what's to come. She's seeing echoes of what has already been. Her visions aren't premonitions, they're memories, carried not from her own life, but from the blood that runs through her veins. This realization reframes the entire narrative. It isn't about glimpsing the future. It's about inheriting the past so vividly that it plays out again in the present. Fate, in this sense, isn't forward-moving, it's circular. This revelation breaks something open in the group. For the first time, they stop running from the inevitability of death and begin to confront it directly. They gather together, not to hide, but to speak openly about the patterns they've seen, about the fears that have gnawed at them in silence. These conversations are raw, jagged, filled with tears and accusations and confessions. And yet, they are also cathartic. For me, these scenes carried the most emotional weight, because they reminded me of moments in my own family when unspoken truths finally surfaced, when silence gave way to honesty. It's terrifying, but it's also liberating. Still, honesty alone cannot save them. The climax builds toward one final confrontation with fate, staged not as a battle with a physical enemy, but as a test of whether the survivors can bear the unbearable weight of their inheritance. They gather in the family home one last time, the storm outside rattling the windows, as though the world itself is holding its breath. Each room feels alive with memory, each creak of the floorboards echoing with footsteps from generations past. They know that death is coming. The question is how they will face it. The sequence that follows is relentless. Accidents unfold in rapid succession, glass shattering, fire sparking, walls collapsing. The survivors scatter through the house, each encounter with fate unfolding like a dance choreographed to perfection. But amid the chaos, there's a crucial act of defiance. One character throws themselves deliberately into harm's way, sacrificing their life in a bid to disrupt the order of deaths. For a moment, it feels as though the chain might be broken, as though love and sacrifice might be enough to rewrite the design. And then comes the final twist, the cruelest and yet most inevitable of them all. The sacrifice doesn't end the cycle, it completes it. The deaths weren't unfolding in some arbitrary order. They were echoing the exact sequence of tragedies from the family's history. By giving their life, the character has simply fulfilled the role that was always destined for them. The circle closes, perfect and merciless. In the aftermath, we're left with only one survivor. The young woman, who has carried the weight of visions from the beginning, finds herself standing alone in the ruins of the ancestral home. The silence is deafening. She looks into a cracked mirror, and for a moment, she sees not her own reflection but the faces of those who came before, layered, overlapping, a lineage of loss staring back at her. And then the reflection blinks, just slightly out of sync with her own movement, leaving us with the haunting question. Is she truly free, or has the cycle simply reset once more? The film ends not with resolution, but with ambiguity. The survivor walks out into the dawn, the storm finally breaking, the world washed clean. Birds sing, the light feels new. And yet, beneath that surface calm, we know better. The cycle has not ended. It has only paused. As the credits rolled in my mind, I felt a strange mixture of dread and awe. It reminded me of the great tragedies I once studied, where catharsis comes not from victory but from recognition. Recognition of who we are, what we inherit, and what we cannot escape. And yet, I also felt a quiet gratitude. Because even within this imagined world of inescapable fate, there were flickers of tenderness, of love, of defiance. And maybe that's what matters most. Not whether we break the cycle, but whether, within it, we find moments of connection that make the inevitability bearable. What lingers with me most when I think about the characters is how ordinary they all are at first glance. How easily you could mistake them for people you know, or perhaps even for people you've been at some point in your life. There is no gleaming hero to anchor the tale, no villain who can be fought and vanquished. Instead, there are individuals caught in a storm, each carrying their own shadows, their own tender vulnerabilities. And in that ordinariness lies the brilliance. The film does not allow us to hide behind archetypes. It asks us instead to see ourselves. The one who draws our attention from the very beginning is the young woman with the visions. She isn't remarkable in any obvious way. She doesn't have the air of someone born to lead or destined to unravel mysteries. And yet, perhaps that is precisely why she resonates so deeply. Her presence is subtle, quiet gestures, a kind of contemplative watchfulness in her eyes. What sets her apart is not authority but receptivity. She notices what others overlook, she senses patterns in the noise. She is both cursed and blessed by perception. I remember the first time she is shown wrestling with what she has seen, trying to articulate the indescribable. There's a tremor in her voice, not just from fear but from the profound loneliness of being the only one who sees clearly. How many times in life have we felt that ache? That painful knowledge of something no one else around us can or will recognize. Watching her, I recalled moments from my own life when I felt like I was carrying a truth that others dismissed, and how isolating that can be. She is not heroic in a cinematic sense. She is heroic in a profoundly human sense. She keeps speaking, keeps noticing, even when it costs her. And yet, she is not defined solely by suffering. She also carries tenderness. In the scenes where she interacts with her younger sibling, her gentleness shines through. Moments of quiet reassurance, whispered promises in the dark. It is this love, I think, that gives her visions their true weight. Without connection, her gift would be only a burden. With connection, it becomes a form of responsibility. She embodies the paradox of knowing too much. The more she sees, the more she loves, and the more it hurts to lose. Her foil, in many ways, is the cousin who walks away. His arc is brief, but it burns with intensity. At first, he is defiant, restless, the kind of person who masks fear with bravado. He scoffs at the whispers of inevitability, insisting that he will carve his own path, that he refuses to be chained to a narrative he did not choose. But beneath that bravado lies fragility, a desperate need to prove that he can escape the gravitational pull of his family's history. His decision to leave is both cowardly and courageous. Cowardly because it abandons those who rely on him, courageous because it takes an audacity few possess to break away at all. His death, though swift, is suffused with tragedy not because it is gruesome, but because it confirms what he most feared. That even escape is part of the pattern. In him, I saw reflections of all of us who have tried to run from the inevitability of who we are, only to find that our shadows travel with us. The aunt, on the other hand, represents a different kind of denial. Her smile is always a little too bright, her laughter pitched just slightly too high. She is the family's mask, the one who insists everything is fine, who busies herself with hospitality and chatter to cover the cracks in the foundation. She reminded me of people I've known who carry their trauma like fine china, always polished, always on display, but fragile enough to shatter at the slightest tremor. Her arc is heartbreaking because her refusal to acknowledge the darkness doesn't protect her. It makes her more vulnerable. When her death comes, it is marked by a tragic irony. She is killed in the very act of trying to maintain appearances, tidying, arranging, smoothing over chaos. Her life and her end both testify to the futility of pretending away the inevitable. Then there is the younger brother, restless and impulsive, whose energy crackles like static. He is the one who pushes against boundaries, who speaks without thinking, who wants so desperately to live that he forgets how fragile life can be. At first, he seems almost comic relief, his impatience and impulsivity providing moments of levity. But as the story darkens, his restlessness becomes something more tragic, a longing for control, for freedom, for a life not dictated by fear. His bond with the young woman is particularly poignant. He looks to her for guidance but resents her knowledge, as though her visions are both a lifeline and a chain around his neck. Their sibling relationship is rendered with such care that I couldn't help but think of my own. The push and pull of love and frustration, the way siblings both shield and wound one another. His eventual death is gutting not because it is unexpected, but because it feels like the extinguishing of youth itself. The reminder that fate does not spare us for being young, that life's fragility is indifferent to age. The eldest cousin serves as a kind of moral compass, though even that role fractures under pressure. At the reunion, he is the dependable one, carrying chairs, pouring drinks, making sure everyone has what they need. He exudes steadiness, the kind of presence that reassures others simply by existing. But as the cycle of deaths begins to unfold, his strength becomes both an asset and a burden. He feels responsible for everyone, as though he can somehow hold the family together by sheer willpower. This responsibility corrodes him, eating away at his calm exterior until we see the cracks. The exhaustion in his eyes, the guilt in his voice, the quiet moments where he stares into nothing, wondering what he could have done differently. His character speaks to that painful truth many of us know, that those who seem the strongest often suffer the most silently. His death, sacrificial and deliberate, is both devastating and inevitable. He embodies the archetype of the protector who cannot save himself, and in that paradox lies his tragedy. Beyond these central figures, the film fills its frame with smaller, quieter presences. The grandmother who says little but whose silence carries volumes. The child whose innocence serves as both hope and torment. The peripheral relatives who drift in and out of scenes like shadows. Each of them adds texture, reminding us that no story exists in isolation. Families are constellations, and even the faintest stars shape the pattern. What fascinates me, though, is how the characters are not only individuals but reflections of larger ideas. Each seems to embody a different response to mortality. The young woman embodies awareness, the burden of seeing too much. The cousin who flees embodies denial, the desperate attempt to outrun inevitability. The aunt embodies performance, the fragile mask of normalcy. The younger brother embodies rebellion, the refusal to accept limits. The eldest cousin embodies responsibility, the futile attempt to protect against the uncontrollable. Together, they form a chorus, each voice echoing the ways humans grapple with the knowledge of death. As their arcs intertwine, the story becomes less about who lives or dies and more about what each death reveals. The aunt's end exposes the futility of denial. The cousin's death shows the failure of escape. The younger brother's demise illustrates the cruelty of fate's indifference. The eldest cousin's sacrifice demonstrates both the nobility and futility of responsibility. And through it all, the young woman remains, not because she is stronger or luckier, but because her role is to bear witness. She survives not as a victor but as a vessel for memory, carrying the weight of every other loss. This resonates with me on a deeply personal level. I've often wondered whether survival itself is a kind of curse. To live when others have gone is to carry a burden of memory, of what could have beens and what will never be against. Watching her at the end, alone in the ruins of her family home, I felt the ache of recognition. Survival is not triumph. It is responsibility. It is endurance. It is the quiet, aching task of remembering. Even the minor characters, those who die quickly or speak little, contribute to this theme. Each death is not just an end but a reflection. The grandmother's silence suggests acceptance, the quiet resignation of one who has lived long enough to understand that resistance is futile. The child's vulnerability underscores the cruelty of cycles that do not discriminate. Each figure, however fleeting, is a piece of the mosaic, a reminder that mortality touches all, without hierarchy, without mercy. What makes this ensemble so compelling is that their struggles are not confined to the horror of the plot. They are the struggles of ordinary people. The desire to protect loved ones, the temptation to deny uncomfortable truths, the burden of responsibility, the longing for freedom. By placing these struggles in the context of supernatural inevitability, the film magnifies them, but it does not distort them. They remain recognizably human, painfully so. In the end, the character who haunts me most is not the one who survived, nor the ones who died in spectacular fashion, but the ensemble as a whole, the chorus of responses to mortality. Together, they remind me that death is not just an event but a mirror. It reveals who we are, how we love, how we fear, how we choose to live in the shadow of inevitability. And in that mirror, I saw not just them but myself, my family, the generations who came before me, and the ones who will come after. The film does not flatter us with the illusion that we can escape fate. Instead, it asks us to look closely at how we meet it, with denial, with rebellion, with responsibility, with love. And in doing so, it becomes not just a story of characters caught in a cycle, but a story of us all, caught in the same cycle of life and death, inheritance and loss. That is what makes these characters unforgettable. They are not heroes or villains. They are human beings, fragile and flawed, luminous and lost, carrying the same burdens we all carry. And perhaps that is why, long after the credits fade, their faces remain with me, not as fictional constructs but as echoes of truths too deep to ignore. What I find almost as fascinating as the imagined story itself are the stranger corners of its supposed making. The whispered tales, the half-documented anecdotes, the uncanny coincidences that seem to haunt the production from the first day cameras rolled. If the film itself is about fate, inevitability, and cycles we cannot escape, then the atmosphere behind its creation seems to have mirrored that theme in ways that are both eerie and oddly poetic. I don't pretend to know whether every story told by the crew is literally true, but I do know that the mythology of a film often says more about its essence than its official script ever could. The strangest thing, perhaps, is how many people described the project as feeling cursed before a single scene was shot. It began with scheduling problems that seemed mundane at first, weather that refused to cooperate, equipment that broke down at the last minute, a location permit that got lost in a tangle of bureaucracy. None of that would have raised eyebrows by itself. Filmmaking is chaos by nature. But what struck people was the pattern. The breakdowns occurred in oddly sequential ways, almost as though mirroring the chain reactions the franchise is known for. A light fixture would fall and narrowly miss a grip. Hours later, a truck delivering props would skid on wet asphalt, its cargo spilling across the road in an intricate domino effect. Then, the next day, a camera lens cracked during transport, fracturing in such a way that crews swore they saw shapes in the splintered glass. Shapes that looked disturbingly like skulls. Stories like these circulated early and often, and the cast, many of them younger, tried to laugh it off. But the veterans, the ones who had worked on earlier entries in the series, were less amused. They whispered that every installment had been shadowed by inexplicable accidents. A stuntman nearly drowned on the second film, though the scene in question didn't involve water. A pyrotechnic on the third suffered burns when equipment ignited at the wrong time, despite safety checks. The fourth had to halt production for weeks after a scaffolding collapse. No fatalities, thank heavens, but enough to seed a legend. That to make one of these films was to court the very forces the story tried to fictionalize. One of the strangest facts, though, is how many creative decisions seem to emerge from coincidence rather than planning. For instance, the central motif of the ancestral house, with its hidden chamber of relics, was not in the earliest drafts of the script. That detail emerged after location scouts stumbled across a property with a basement full of genuine, dust-laden antiques left untouched for decades. The production designer later admitted that when they opened one particular trunk, they found old photographs that eerily resembled some of the actors already cast, enough of a resemblance that even skeptics shivered. Rather than dismissing it, the director leaned into the coincidence, rewriting scenes to incorporate the basement and its relics into the story. Art imitated life, or perhaps life bent itself into art. There's also the matter of the mirror sequence. You'll remember the haunting moment at the end where the young woman stares into the cracked mirror and sees overlapping faces of her lineage. That shot, one of the most striking in the film, was reportedly born out of an accident. The production had purchased an antique mirror for set dressing, never intending it to play a major role. But during filming, the mirror slipped from its stand and cracked into a spiderweb pattern. Instead of discarding it, the cinematographer suggested they experiment with shooting through it. When the actress stood before the shattered surface, the camera captured her reflection multiplied, fragmented, and warped in ways no special effect could replicate. The crew swore that in some frames, the broken glass seemed to create extra faces not accounted for by angles or perspective. The footage was so chilling they decided to build the climax around it. Another oddity lies in the film's sound design. One technician swore that while editing audio for the storm sequence, he captured a low-frequency hum that hadn't been recorded on set. At first, he thought it was interference from equipment, but when he isolated the track, the hum seemed to pulse rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. He layered it beneath the thunder as a kind of subliminal effect, though others on the team begged him to remove it, saying it made them feel nauseous or uneasy. Audiences later reported the storm scene was among the most unsettling moments, though they couldn't articulate why. Perhaps the sound was simply clever design, or perhaps something stranger slipped into the mix. Even casting was touched by strangeness. The young woman at the center of the story had not been the first choice for the role. The actress originally cast withdrew suddenly, citing personal reasons that were never made public. The replacement, relatively unknown at the time, stepped in with only days to prepare. What unsettled some on the crew was how naturally she inhabited the role, as though she had been born for it. Several people remarked that she improvised small gestures, touching her necklace during tense moments, closing her eyes as if bracing for unseen visions. That later aligned perfectly with the rewritten script, though she hadn't seen those pages yet. It was as though the character had been waiting for her all along. The cousin who dies in the rainstorm also carried his own strange aura. He was, by all accounts, a light-hearted presence on set, always joking, always lifting spirits. Yet in interviews after filming, he confessed that he had recurring dreams throughout production. Dreams of water, of spinning headlights, of glass breaking. He even described one nightmare almost identical to his death scene, before it had been storyboarded. When asked about it, he laughed nervously and said, "Maybe I read too much of the script in my sleep." But his unease was palpable. Perhaps the most unnerving behind-the-scenes story involves the railroad sequence. The crew had secured permission to film near inactive tracks, but on the morning of the shoot, they arrived to find fresh signs of use, rails polished, gravel disturbed. No trains had been scheduled, according to official records, yet locals insisted they'd heard one pass during the night. While setting up cameras, the ground began to vibrate faintly, though no train appeared. Some of the crew swore they heard the distant whistle of an engine, carried on the wind. The director, shaken, considered canceling the sequence altogether. But they pressed on, and when the scene was finally filmed, it unfolded with an intensity no one could explain. Then there are the small, uncanny coincidences that peppered daily production. Prop candles that refused to stay lit unless certain actors were in the room. A clock on set that always stopped at the same time, 3:17 a.m. A raven that appeared repeatedly at outdoor shoots, perching silently on light rigs, watching, and then vanishing. None of these incidents taken alone would mean much. But strung together, they built an atmosphere that crew members described as living inside the film. Even post-production wasn't free from strangeness. Editors reported that certain reels seemed to glitch inexplicably. Frames would duplicate or disappear, though nothing was wrong with the equipment. In one case, a reel showed an extra figure in the background of a shot, a blurry silhouette by a window watching the cast. When they tried to track down the error, they found nothing. The figure wasn't on set photographs, nor in alternate takes. It exists only in that single reel, preserved like a ghost. What fascinates me is how the film seems to attract stories even after its completion. Viewers began reporting eerie experiences after screenings. Smoke alarms going off during pivotal scenes, televisions flickering during home viewings, sudden gusts of wind rattling windows at the exact moment a character died on screen. Rational explanations abound, of course. But rationality doesn't strip away the uncanny. If anything, it sharpens it. I think often about why we are drawn to such trivia, why these facts matter even when we can't verify them. Perhaps it's because they remind us that art is porous, that the boundary between story and life is thinner than we think. We tell ourselves these anecdotes because they extend the narrative beyond the screen, because they make us complicit in the haunting. To know that a mirror cracked by accident became the centerpiece of the climax, or that an actor dreamed their own death before filming it, is to feel that the story has reached out of fiction and touched the real world. And perhaps that is what makes these facts, strange, unverifiable, poetic, so powerful. They are less about proving anything than about deepening the myth. Just as the characters in the film inherit the weight of their family's tragedies, so too do we, as an audience, inherit the weight of its production lore. We become part of the cycle. We tell the stories, and in telling, we keep them alive. Sometimes I wonder whether that's the true genius of this imagined creation. Not just that it tells a story about inevitability, but that it becomes inevitable itself, pulling coincidences and accidents into its orbit until life and art echo one another. That, to me, is the strangest fact of all, not something captured on film or noted in production logs, but something intangible. The feeling that this story was not merely invented but summoned, called into being from the fabric of fate itself. And as I sit here recounting these behind-the-scenes tales, I can't help but feel that in some small way, I too am part of that cycle. By remembering, by sharing, I am helping it continue, as though stories themselves demand survival, as though even in fiction, nothing ever really ends. What has stayed with me most about this film are not just its twists and shocks, but the deeper currents beneath them. The way each significant event seems less like a random occurrence and more like a carefully orchestrated note in a symphony of dread and inevitability. Watching it felt, at times, like listening to a piece of music where the melody was beautiful, but the silence between notes was just as important. That's where the unease seeped in, and that's where meaning began to crystallize. Take the opening sequence, the storm, the car, the near miss that becomes a tragedy. On the surface, it works as the explosive hook every audience expects from this franchise, the almost operatic staging of disaster. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized how literary its structure felt. The storm isn't just weather, it's fate itself made physical. The way headlights slice through rain, how water blurs vision and obscures perspective, how decisions in those conditions feel both desperate and delayed. All of it mirrors the larger thematic concern of inevitability. When I first watched, I felt my stomach clench not because of the rain or the crash itself, but because of how familiar the helplessness was. Haven't we all had those moments where the world seems to unravel around us, where each choice feels insufficient? I found myself remembering a night in my own life, driving home under a sky that seemed determined to collapse. Sheets of rain so thick my wipers were useless, lightning splitting the dark like judgment. In that moment, my body felt small, my choices meaningless. I wasn't watching glass shatter or steel twist, but I could imagine it. That's the emotional resonance of the opening. It forces us to recall our own fragility, and in doing so, it sets the stage for everything that follows. Then there is the moment when the protagonist discovers the ancestral house's hidden chamber. I can't think of another event in the film that more clearly bridges the gap between horror and literature. On one level, it's pure Gothic imagery, dust, relics, dim light revealing the weight of history. But on another, it's a meditation on inheritance, on the way our lives are shaped by decisions made long before we arrived. When she runs her fingers across the faded photographs, when she opens the cracked journal filled with half-legible writing, I felt as though I was reading a palimpsest, one story written atop another, yet neither fully erased. It reminded me of something a professor once said in a seminar on Greek tragedy, that fate is not an outside force acting upon us, but the cumulative echo of generations. We inherit choices, debts, mistakes, patterns, and then we mistake them for inevitability. The film seemed to be saying the same thing, albeit in the language of horror. It wasn't death's plan stalking her so much as the shadow of what had always been there, waiting for her to open the right door. From a critical perspective, the sequence also plays with audience expectation in a fascinating way. Normally in horror, discovery equals empowerment. The heroine finds the tool or the knowledge that helps her survive. Here, discovery equals burden. Every object in that basement is another chain added to her, another reminder that escape is not freedom but postponement. That inversion is what makes it linger. I left the theater not thinking about ghosts or demons, but about the objects in my own family home. Photographs of people I never met, heirlooms whose stories have been lost, and how I too carry legacies I don't always understand. Perhaps the most haunting event, though, is the cousin's death in the storm, the one where shattered glass and water blur into a kaleidoscope of terror. On the surface, it's a standard installment death scene. Intricate, ironic, choreographed like a dance with doom. But what struck me watching it unfold was how mercilessly personal it felt. He wasn't just a character ticking toward an inevitable end. He was a young man whose laughter we'd heard, whose vulnerability we'd glimpsed. The cruel poetry of his death wasn't in the spectacle but in the timing, arriving just after a moment of near connection, as though the universe delights in interrupting tenderness with violence. Critically, this scene operates as a thesis. Death in this narrative isn't punishment for sin, nor reward for virtue. It is arbitrary, indiscriminate, yet patterned in a way that feels designed. That contradiction is what gives it its emotional power. And that contradiction mirrors real life, doesn't it? We tell ourselves stories to explain why things happen, karma, justice, luck. But deep down, we know randomness plays just as much of a role. Watching him slip away in that storm was like having that contradiction played out in miniature, leaving me unsettled long after the credits. Then there's the railroad sequence. It's one of the film's most visually kinetic set pieces, and yet what I find fascinating is how it functions symbolically. Railroads, after all, are designed to go in one direction. Once you're on the track, your path is determined until the end of the line. What better metaphor for fate? The tension of the scene is not just in whether the characters will escape, but in the way the setting itself underscores the futility of choice. They run parallel to the tracks, try to cross them, even scream at the approaching force, but the outcome is inevitable. Watching it, I felt the futility in my own body, as though the very act of resisting fate had become absurd. What elevates the railroad moment beyond spectacle is how it layers fear with recognition. I thought of times in my life when I felt trapped in a trajectory I couldn't alter. A job that drained me, a relationship already unraveling, a series of decisions that locked me into an outcome I didn't want. The rails beneath their feet might as well have been beneath mine. That's the strange alchemy of the scene. It's not just adrenaline, it's empathy. Of course, the climax, the mirror sequence, is the one that lingers most powerfully. Watching her face fracture into dozens of overlapping images, seeing her lineage merge and splinter, felt like watching a thesis turn visual. We are not singular, the film says. We are the sum of everyone who came before us, and their choices ripple through us whether we like it or not. Some viewers might see horror in that realization. I saw melancholy beauty. It reminded me of holding my grandmother's hands and noticing how my own fingers have begun to resemble hers, how traits leap generations and reappear in the smallest gestures. The mirror does not just reflect her. It reflects inevitability, inheritance, the permanence of cycles. From a critical perspective, this final image cements the film as more than entertainment. It situates it within the long tradition of literature and art obsessed with mirrors, not just as reflective objects, but as portals, as symbols of truth we can't bear. Think of Borges' fascination with the infinity of mirrors, or Lacan's theory of the mirror stage, or even the fairy tale admonition of Snow White's queen. Mirrors force confrontation, and here, that confrontation is with the inevitability of history. What strikes me most, though, is how the film balances its critical heft with visceral emotion. It is easy to say the mirror represents inheritance, but it's harder to describe the way it feels to watch her eyes widen in recognition, to see her lips tremble as though she wants to scream but can't. That's where the resonance lies. Not in intellectual interpretation alone, but in the way our bodies respond before our minds can explain. When the credits rolled, I sat in silence. Around me, others shuffled, whispered, reached for their phones. But I stayed still, because I wasn't ready to leave the weight of what I'd just seen. The significant events weren't just shocks or narrative beats. They were meditations, each one probing at a truth we'd rather keep hidden. And the impact of that, I think, is what has led to the film's reception being so polarized. Some dismiss it as another stylish horror entry. Others, like me, see it as something more, a story that dares to suggest we are bound to patterns larger than ourselves. In the end, the thematic resonance is not one of despair, but of recognition. The storm, the house, the railroad, the mirror. Each event tells us that life is fragile, inheritance is heavy, and fate feels inescapable. Yet in acknowledging that, we find a strange form of solidarity. We recognize ourselves in the characters, in their struggles, in their futile resistance. And perhaps that is the film's greatest achievement. Not that it terrifies us, but that it makes us feel less alone in our fear. That, I think, is why it continues to echo long after the screen goes dark. When I think back on this movie, the story itself is only half of what lingers with me. The other half, the part that glows in memory like a secret, is the production itself, the messy, miraculous, sometimes chaotic process that turned a set of ideas into the experience we eventually saw on screen. To me, that process is as much a story as the film. It's a tale of accidents and artistry, of human hands shaping shadows, of laughter behind the camera even while terror unfolded before it. I always find myself fascinated by this duality. On screen we see panic, fear, destruction. But off-screen, someone's holding a boom mic just out of frame. Someone's giggling between takes because fake blood has stained their sneakers. Someone's frantically retying a knot on a harness, praying the rig holds for the next stunt. That juxtaposition makes me love movies more, not less. It reminds me that what terrifies us in the darkened theater is, at its core, the result of incredible human collaboration, ingenuity, and sometimes even sheer luck. The storm sequence, for instance, the opening event that sweeps us into chaos, wasn't filmed with endless CGI, as one might assume. Yes, digital tools were used to enhance the downpour, to extend the horizon, to make lightning flare with that unnatural sharpness. But much of what we saw was real. Huge rain machines, massive rigs that pump thousands of gallons of water into the air, were brought in to create the sheets of rain. The production team spent nights in soaked clothes, wrapped in blankets between takes, sipping coffee just to stop shivering. One crew member reportedly joked that they were less a film unit and more a water park staff by the end of the sequence. What makes this even more remarkable is how the team choreographed the stunt work in those conditions. Cars on slick roads, actors running through puddles, sparks from faux electrical wires. It all had to be timed with impossible precision. One wrong move and it wouldn't just ruin a take, it could injure someone. That awareness adds another layer of awe for me. When we watch the opening and feel tension knot in our stomachs, part of what we're responding to is the real danger and discomfort of those who created it. It's not just simulated peril, it's bodies genuinely straining, genuinely slipping, genuinely fighting elements conjured by machines and imagination. And then there's the hidden chamber sequence. I remember reading about how the art department obsessed over every detail of that space. They wanted it to feel like a repository of forgotten lives, as though you could smell dust and mildew just by looking at the screen. To achieve this, they scoured flea markets and estate sales, collecting boxes of old photographs, half-broken furniture, cracked glassware. Many of the items we see in that chamber were real, pulled from attics where they'd been untouched for decades. One photograph in particular, a faded portrait of a stern woman with piercing eyes, wasn't even meant to be central. It was simply placed on a shelf. But when the actress brushed dust from its frame during a take, the director decided to linger on it. That unplanned moment transformed the photograph into an eerie motif, threading through later scenes like an echo. What I love about stories like that is how they remind us of cinema's accidental poetry. So often, the images that stay with us weren't scripted, weren't planned, weren't born of design. They were stumbled upon, embraced, shaped by the willingness of filmmakers to notice beauty, or horror, when it revealed itself. The railroad sequence carries its own set of behind-the-scenes marvels. Those tracks weren't CGI, they were real, and the team had to negotiate with a regional transport authority to secure permission to film there. The actual trains were, of course, never allowed to run full speed anywhere near the set. Instead, sections of train cars were rigged up on short tracks, pulled slowly by mechanical rigs while cameras framed them to look faster. But here's the trick. The sound design team recorded the thunderous roar of freight trains months earlier and layered it in later. That's why the scene rattles our bones. It's not just visuals, but the memory of real sound stitched into the fabric of the moment. Filming that sequence was grueling. The actors sprinted along gravel for take after take, their shoes wearing thin, their throats raw from shouting. Between takes, crew members patched bruises and offered water. At one point, a camera operator tripped on uneven terrain, falling hard and scraping his hands. Instead of halting the shoot entirely, he wiped off the blood, adjusted the rig, and muttered that if the actors could keep running, so could he. It's small anecdotes like these that reveal the grit behind the glamour, the sheer stubbornness that makes filmmaking possible. The mirror sequence at the climax, though, holds the crown for production ingenuity. That effect wasn't fully CGI either. The team constructed a practical set of angled mirrors, arranged in a labyrinthine pattern. The actress had to navigate this maze while cameras captured her from multiple points. The reflections were real, captured in camera, with only minimal digital touch-ups later. That's why the sequence feels so visceral. It's not a digital illusion, but a physical one. Watching her move through it was as much a dance as a performance, carefully choreographed so that cameras would catch both her fear and her fracturing image. Crew members joked that the set was haunted not by spirits, but by the endless sight of themselves, caught in stray reflections. There's a bittersweet anecdote from that shoot that's always stuck with me. One day, the actress reportedly broke down in tears between takes. Not because of the difficulty of the performance, but because the endless reflections triggered a flood of childhood memories. She remembered standing in a funhouse mirror room as a little girl, overwhelmed by the strangeness of seeing herself multiply. Filmmaking often digs into unexpected corners of memory like that, and it struck me as poetic that a scene about inheritance and identity would evoke such a personal response. Beyond the set pieces, there were lighter moments too. Those bits of levity that keep a horror production from collapsing under its own weight. Fake blood, for instance, is notorious in the industry for being sticky, staining clothes, and tasting awful if it accidentally gets in your mouth. On this production, one of the actors kept a running gag of rating the different blood batches. This one tastes like cough syrup. This one's more like bad cherry soda. Soon, the crew began referring to blood takes by their flavor, turning something grotesque into a kind of inside joke. Even the weather became part of the production's folklore. During one outdoor shoot, thunder rolled unexpectedly, interrupting take after take. The director finally threw up his hands and said, "Fine, let the sky direct." They used the storm as atmosphere, weaving it into the film instead of fighting it. It's little acts of surrender like this, letting reality bleed into art, that give films their authenticity. And then there's the matter of safety rigs. Many of the elaborate death scenes involved complicated harnesses, wires, and hidden supports. One stunt performer, tasked with simulating a fall through a collapsing floor, joked afterward that he felt like a marionette dancing for death itself. He wore the bruises proudly, saying they were his marks of honor. His comment stayed with me because it revealed something profound. Even those orchestrating death on screen were acutely aware of its symbolism. They weren't just simulating stunts, they were embodying the metaphor of fragility that the film itself was trying to express. When I reflect on all these production details, what strikes me most is how they mirror the themes of the story itself. Just as the characters confront fate through chance, accident, and inevitability, the production too was full of accidents, chance discoveries, and moments of inevitability. A photograph accidentally becomes iconic. A storm interrupts filming and becomes part of the film's fabric. A joke about blood flavor turns fear into laughter. Life and art intertwine, and the line between design and accident blurs. To me, that's the magic of filmmaking. It's never just execution of a plan. It's improvisation, adaptation, resilience. And when we look closely at the production of this particular film, we see that spirit everywhere. We see it in drenched crew members shivering through endless takes. We see it in art directors scouring flea markets for forgotten relics. We see it in stunt performers embracing bruises as badges. And we see it in the way the film itself seems to acknowledge those efforts, weaving them into its final form like threads in a tapestry. By the time the credits rolled on that production, I imagine the exhaustion was palpable. But so was pride. Because what we saw on screen wasn't just a horror story, it was the echo of countless human stories layered beneath it, stories of resilience, humor, accidents, and craft. That's what I carry with me when I think of the film. Not just the images that unsettled me, but the people who conjured them, the hands that held the cameras, the eyes that noticed beauty in dust, the voices that laughed in the rain. And maybe that's why, even long after leaving the theater, the film still feels alive to me. Because behind every scream and shadow, there was a team of human beings, tired, drenched, laughing, stubborn, turning chaos into art. I often think that a film is not just told by its characters or its plot, but by its spaces. The places where scenes unfold, their textures, their silences, their shadows, become as important as any character. Sometimes they're even more honest. Because while people lie, change, or vanish, a place holds memory. It whispers truth, even when no one is listening. This film, perhaps more than most, seemed acutely aware of that. The settings weren't backdrops. They were haunted witnesses, complicit in every twist of fate. The first time I saw the storm sequence, I felt it in my skin. The setting wasn't just a highway in the rain. It was a liminal space, caught between familiarity and dread. The slick asphalt reflected the downpour like a black mirror. Streetlights bent into distorted halos, and the horizon dissolved into gray nothingness. There's something deeply unsettling about such ordinary places. The ones we pass every day, suddenly rendered hostile. That's the genius of how the camera lingered there. It didn't rush us into chaos. It allowed the rain-smeared windshields, the blinking hazard lights, the tremble of wipers to build an atmosphere of fragile calm before it shattered. And when it did shatter, it wasn't simply the spectacle of destruction that stayed with me. It was the intimacy of detail. The cinematography captured the small things. A child's toy left on a back seat, a coffee cup rolling across a dashboard, a cracked rearview mirror dangling uselessly. Those details made the highway feel less like a disaster zone and more like an open wound, exposing fragments of ordinary life caught in extraordinary terror. Later, the shift to the hidden chamber pulled me into an entirely different register of mood. Gone was the openness of roads and stormy skies. Here, the walls pressed close, heavy with decay. The setting seemed to pulse with memory. What I remember most vividly is how the cinematography played with darkness, not simply as absence of light, but as texture. Shadows weren't just voids, they were layered, shifting, as though hiding things just out of sight. A flickering lantern wasn't a neutral prop, it was a trembling heartbeat, its glow failing against the weight of the room. What fascinated me was how the chamber felt alive. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the cinematic one. The camera didn't frame it as a static set. Instead, it moved with curiosity, as though discovering corners and objects alongside the characters. Dust motes caught in shafts of light felt almost sacred, reminding me of how memory lingers in neglected spaces. That environment carried a personality, part curiosity, part menace. It was as if the setting itself were warning us, even before words were spoken. The railroad sequence pulled me back into openness, but openness of a very different kind. Here, space wasn't suffocating, it was overwhelming. The tracks stretched into forever, vanishing into the horizon, like a grim metaphor for inevitability. What struck me was the scale, the way the cinematography leaned low, aligning the rails so they became lines that sliced through the screen, drawing our eyes forward, forward, always forward. You could almost feel the weight of destiny bearing down. There's an image that hasn't left me. The reflection of flashing lights in the metal rails, glowing red and blue like veins of fire under skin. It was such a small detail, yet it encapsulated everything the film wanted to say about inevitability, danger, and fragility. Sound, too, contributed. Though I'm straying toward auditory memory, the way the visual rhythm paired with that thunderous hum made the setting vibrate with menace. The railroad wasn't just a place where a scene happened. It was destiny-made geography. But nothing haunted me quite like the mirror sequence. If the chamber whispered and the tracks thundered, the mirror labyrinth screamed in silence. It's one thing to watch reflections multiply in a funhouse. It's another to watch them fracture in darkness, each shard reflecting a slightly different version of the same figure, each distorted, each menacing in its own way. The cinematography here wasn't simply technical, it was psychological. Angles doubled, tripled, split focus until even I, sitting safely in my seat, felt my sense of self flicker. The genius lay in how the mirrors were lit. Sometimes the reflections were sharp, clear, endless. Other times they dissolved into shadow, leaving only glimpses of movement. That instability created a constant sense of unease. I couldn't tell where the real body stood, and where only glass played tricks. And maybe that's the point. In that setting, identity itself became uncertain. The place turned character against themselves. That's the power of environment, wielded not as ornament, but as a force of narrative. I think often of how these settings echo larger themes. The storm reminds us of fragility, of how quickly order can collapse. The chamber embodies memory, inheritance, the weight of the forgotten. The railroad stands for inevitability, fate pressing forward whether we're ready or not. The mirrors capture the terror of multiplicity, of seeing too many versions of ourselves, none entirely true. And the cinematography doesn't just show us these places. It interprets them, bends them, makes them speak. Even smaller settings carried immense weight. A hospital corridor with its sterile lights buzzing overhead felt like purgatory. The camera lingered too long on an empty gurney, and suddenly, that absence became louder than dialogue. A suburban kitchen, sunlit and ordinary, turned uncanny the moment the faucet dripped in irregular rhythm. The filmmakers seemed to understand that horror thrives not only in the extraordinary, but in the banal, that the scariest settings are often the ones we think we know. There's also the way color worked across these spaces. In the storm, hues were washed out, grays, muted blues, a sense of drained vitality. In the chamber, earth tones dominated, browns, yellows, decay seeping into the palette. The railroad gleamed with metallic silvers, punctuated by harsh artificial reds from signals. And the mirrors? They pulsed with stark contrasts. White light against black shadow, reflections like knives cutting the frame. Each setting wasn't just a place. It was a mood painted in color and light. Camera movement deserves its own reflection. The storm was filmed with restless motion, shaky, handheld shots that made me feel trapped in the chaos. The chamber was deliberate, slow, almost reverent, letting my eyes wander and dread build. The railroad used sweeping pans and tracking shots, pulling me into its sense of inevitability. And the mirror maze? Jarring cuts, disorienting shifts, sudden close-ups, cinema as vertigo. Each approach wasn't arbitrary. It was a deliberate translation of the setting's emotional truth. What makes me love these choices is how they acknowledge the viewer not as a passive observer, but as a participant. We don't just watch a storm, we stumble through it. We don't just peek into a chamber, we feel its air thick in our lungs. We don't just watch a train approach, we sense it bearing down on us. And in the mirror sequence, we don't just watch identity fracture. We experience our own gaze splintering, uncertain of where to look, uncertain of what's real. I've always believed that settings in cinema are like stages in a dream. They don't just hold the story, they reveal it, shape it, distort it. And this film, with its uncanny precision, seemed to understand that. It didn't waste a single location. Every setting was chosen to press on our psyche, to amplify dread, to make us question not just what we were seeing, but where we were standing within it. That's the beauty of its cinematic elements. They weren't decoration. They were meaning itself, expressed through light, shadow, space, and silence. And that's why, long after the story faded, the images of those places lingered with me. A rain-slick road, a dust-choked chamber, rails vanishing into forever, 1,000 broken mirrors reflecting nothing but fear. They're still here with me even now. I always find it moving to imagine how films are made. The finished product looks so smooth, seamless, inevitable, as if it were always destined to appear that way. But behind the camera, it's often a fragile, messy dance of improvisation, exhaustion, and laughter. This one, in particular, had a behind-the-scenes life as strange and layered as the story it eventually told. What struck me first, when I began digging into it, was how much of the production seemed to be guided by chance. Weather, for example, was a constant character. That opening storm sequence, the one with the rain-slicked highway, wasn't originally planned to look the way it did. On the day of shooting, the crew had prepped an artificial rain rig, miles of hoses and pumps, ready to conjure their downpour. And then, as if nature had been reading the script, the skies broke open on their own. A genuine storm rolled in, fierce and relentless. At first, panic. Equipment wasn't ready, lenses fogged instantly, and safety officers worried the roads were too dangerous. But then the director, grinning like a child who'd just stumbled on buried treasure, told the crew to keep rolling. Actors ran into position, drenched to the bone, and the storm itself became the film's collaborator. The authenticity of the rain, the way it blurred windshields, hammered asphalt, and turned reflections into black glass, couldn't have been manufactured. Later, some joked that the storm deserved its own credit. That accident set the tone for the production. Again and again, what looked like disaster became possibility. Take the underground chamber. The set was supposed to be built entirely on a soundstage, meticulously designed with foam stone walls and safe, flexible props. But midway through pre-production, the art department discovered an abandoned storage facility just outside town. Its concrete walls were cracked, water leaked from pipes overhead, and dust coated everything in sight. Most people saw a hazard. The director saw a gift. With minimal dressing, a few props, a bit of lighting, the space transformed into something far richer than any studio construction could deliver. Of course, working there was anything but easy. The crew called it the lung. After just a few hours, throats itched from dust, and hair carried the smell of mildew. One actor, after a particularly long shoot day, joked during a break, "If we don't get possessed by spirits down here, at least we'll leave with a respiratory condition." The laughter that followed cut through the fatigue. They'd sit on overturned crates, sipping water, wiping grime from their faces, and bond over the absurdity of it all. What I love most about such moments is how they reveal the resilience of people who make movies. They find camaraderie in discomfort, weaving humor into frustration until it becomes fuel. Then there was the mirror labyrinth sequence. This part of production carried its own mythos. Originally, the crew built a small section of mirrors, planning to extend the maze digitally in post-production. But when the cast stepped into even that limited setup, something magical happened. The reflections multiplied endlessly, bending light, creating angles that seemed otherworldly even before editing. The cinematographer, overwhelmed with possibilities, begged to expand the practical set. What followed was weeks of madness. Crew members kept vanishing, not literally, but getting lost in reflections while adjusting lights. One day, a camera assistant walked full speed into what he thought was an open space, only to slam against glass so hard it rattled the frame. They laughed after making sure he was okay, but stories like that piled up. The maze became notorious. Actors confessed that performing in it was emotionally exhausting. Every gesture looked amplified, every glance reflected back 100 times, until they felt like they were drowning in versions of themselves. It mirrored the themes of the film more deeply than they'd planned. And then the railroad sequence. This was the most technically challenging, because filming near live tracks involved layers of safety restrictions. They rehearsed for weeks without trains, marking movements, timing cues with stopwatches. The first time a real train thundered by during a take, the ground shook, props rattled, and adrenaline surged through everyone on set. A boom operator later confessed he cried afterward, not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the experience. That's something we rarely think about. Behind every frame of cinematic spectacle, there are crew members quietly bearing the emotional toll of orchestrating danger. But it wasn't all stress and tension. There were playful moments, too. On quieter days, the crew invented little rituals. Someone started a lucky coin game. They'd hide a coin somewhere on set, and whoever found it had to carry it in their pocket until wrap. If the coin was lost, they claimed bad luck would follow the shoot until it was recovered. It became a superstitious joke, but one people took strangely seriously. The coin went missing for 3 days once, and during that time, lights blew out twice and a generator died. When it resurfaced, tucked into a grip's tool belt, the collective sigh of relief felt genuine. Another ritual involved food. A local bakery began delivering pastries every morning, and soon Donut O'Clock became the unofficial second breakfast on set. No matter how dark or intense the scenes being filmed, when that pink pastry box arrived, spirits lifted. One actor recalled between takes in the mirror maze, standing in full costume, hands trembling from the psychological strain, then biting into a jelly-filled donut and suddenly laughing uncontrollably. It was absurd but also necessary. I think that's what makes these stories resonate with me. The reminder that even in the darkest films, laughter sustains the people making them. Of course, not every challenge could be softened by humor. Scheduling was brutal. Some sequences required night shoots, and for weeks, cast and crew lived entirely in nocturnal rhythm. They'd emerge from set at dawn, eyes burning, skin pale from fluorescent lights, feeling more like creatures of the shadows than humans. The fatigue wore on everyone. Tempers flared occasionally. One heated argument between departments nearly derailed a night's shoot. But what impresses me is how quickly apologies followed. People recognized that the pressure wasn't personal. It was part of the fragile alchemy of filmmaking, where exhaustion and passion run side by side. The director, I've learned, had a habit during those hard nights. When morale dipped, he'd call for a short break, gather everyone in the center of the set, and remind them of why they were there. Not with corporate pep talks, but with simple, human words. We're telling a story that means something. And none of it exists without you. Crew members later described those moments as lifelines. In the chaos of cables and call sheets, sometimes what people needed most was to feel seen. There was also a remarkable bond between the cast and crew. Often there's a divide, actors in one circle, crew in another. But here they blurred. Between setups, you'd find lead actors carrying gear, or grips rehearsing lines as jokes. One camera operator remembered sitting with an actress in full costume during a rain delay, both of them quietly watching the storm without speaking, sharing a silence that felt strangely profound. It wasn't just work, it was a community. And maybe that's why the film feels the way it does, textured, layered, alive. Because the process of making it wasn't sterile. It was messy, human, unpredictable. The stories that linger most, though, are the small accidents that turned into gifts. A lantern in the chamber, meant to flicker gently, suddenly sputtered and went out during a take. The actor, startled, improvised a reaction that conveyed raw fear. The director loved it so much that he insisted they rewrite the moment to keep the darkness. In another scene, a mirror cracked under unexpected heat from a light. Instead of discarding it, they filmed the jagged reflection, which became one of the film's most striking visuals. These things remind me that cinema, for all its planning and precision, often thrives on accidents. Art is born not only from intention but from surrender, the willingness to let chaos collaborate. When I think of the film now, I don't just see the finished images. I imagine the crew, wet from unexpected storms, choking on dust in forgotten chambers, laughing over donuts, chasing a superstitious coin, collapsing into chairs at dawn. I imagine the exhaustion in their bones and the spark in their eyes when they realized they were creating something that would outlive those sleepless nights. Behind-the-scenes stories like these matter because they remind us that movies aren't conjured by magic. They're built by people. Flesh and blood, nerves and laughter, patience and mistakes. And sometimes, when those people lean into chaos instead of resisting it, the film they make feels richer, stranger, more alive. And maybe that's why, when I watch it now, the settings feel so charged, the cinematography so visceral, the atmosphere so haunted. Because I know that behind every shadow, there's a crew member holding a light. Behind every reflection, someone adjusting glass. Behind every storm, a team that surrendered to the real rain. The beauty of cinema is not just what we see on screen. It's the invisible story of how it came to be. And in this case, that invisible story is as fascinating, messy, and human as the film itself. There's something almost ritualistic about watching a film like this one. On the surface, it plays like suspense, like a series of hair-trigger set pieces designed to shock. But when you sit with it, when you let its images echo, you start to notice that it's not just a game of survival, but a kind of philosophical riddle. That's what I want to share here. The way its themes hum quietly under the chaos, and how its symbols carry a weight that lingers long after the credits. The first theme that rises almost immediately is inevitability. Fate versus agency. From the opening moments, when the storm lashes down and characters are thrust into circumstances they didn't choose, there's a recurring question. Do we ever really steer our lives, or are we walking along invisible lines already drawn for us? It's a theme that echoes myths and tragedies from centuries past. Oedipus fleeing his prophecy, Macbeth chasing his, characters who believe they can outwit the universe only to find themselves folded back into its design. I remember the first time I noticed how insistently the film returned to images of circles. A spinning wheel, a reflection in water, the curve of a tunnel arch. None of these are accidents. They're quiet whispers of inevitability. That life moves in loops, that death bends back to claim what it missed. There's something unsettling but also strangely comforting about that. Watching those circles, I found myself thinking of moments in my own life when I thought I'd escaped something, only to face it again later, disguised but familiar. Another theme runs right beside inevitability: inheritance. The title itself gestures at bloodlines, and while the movie shows this in literal ways, family trees, legacies carried forward, it's also about the emotional and spiritual debts we inherit. One character speaks of her grandmother's recurring nightmares, only to realize she's begun having the same dreams. Another clings to an heirloom locket, believing it offers protection, but really it becomes a reminder of how the past refuses to let go. That struck me deeply because I think we all wrestle with the question of what's ours and what we've inherited, not just possessions but fears, traumas, even habits of thought. Do we carry our ancestors inside us, or are we free to be something entirely new? The film doesn't offer an easy answer, but its symbols, the locket, the dreams, the fractured mirror reflections, keep circling back to that tension. Mirrors themselves are one of the most potent symbols here. They appear again and again, not just in the literal labyrinth sequence but in subtler ways. Characters catching glimpses of themselves distorted in windows, reflections shimmering in puddles. Mirrors, of course, are old storytellers. They speak of identity, of the double we carry inside, of truths we avoid. In this film, they go further. They remind us that death itself is a kind of mirror. What we fear, what we flee, is often just our own reflection magnified until we cannot look away. And then there are the trains. The recurring imagery of tracks, of unstoppable movement, resonates with the theme of fate. A train is both freedom and trap. It takes you forward, but only along its rails. The characters in those sequences aren't just endangered by physical machinery. They're confronted with the metaphor of their own lives. No matter how fast they run, the rails remain. Watching those scenes, I couldn't help thinking of times I've felt swept along by decisions I didn't fully choose, carried forward by momentum I couldn't resist. Light and shadow become their own symbolic language here, too. In many scenes, lanterns sputter, flashlights flicker, light bulbs stutter before going out. Darkness doesn't just obscure. It asserts itself, reclaiming space. I read it not just as horror atmosphere, but as commentary on the fragility of human certainty. We believe we hold the light. We believe we can illuminate the unknown. But the film reminds us how easily that confidence is extinguished. The storm, from the very beginning, lingers as another symbol. It's more than weather. It represents chaos breaking through order. Storms have always carried this weight in literature. Think of King Lear raging on the heath, or the biblical flood, or even the storm that hounds Prospero's island in The Tempest. Here, the storm feels almost sentient, like a force reminding characters that the world isn't safe, that nature itself conspires in death's design. But for me, the most haunting theme is memory. Characters don't just experience fear in the present. They are haunted by echoes of the past, by glimpses of possible futures. Memory in this film is less about personal recollection and more about ancestral memory, collective memory, almost as though the bloodlines themselves are carrying knowledge of death forward. It makes every choice heavy, as if characters are reliving someone else's mistakes. And here's where I'll tell you something that made me lean closer: the use of recurring symbols in sound. The faint whistle of a train in the distance. The crack of glass. The low rumble of thunder even when the skies are clear. These aren't just auditory cues. They're symbols in themselves, little reminders of the looming inevitability. Sound becomes a character, a symbolic language whispering fate's presence even in silence. Another powerful layer lies in how the film uses space. Tunnels, chambers, mazes, these aren't random locations. They symbolize the subconscious, the interior spaces we fear to explore. Each setting becomes a metaphor for inner struggle. The tunnel is denial, narrow and suffocating. The chamber is inheritance, filled with echoes of the past. The mirror maze is identity, fractured and multiplied. And the railroad is inevitability, a forward rush that cannot be stopped. I found myself reflecting on how these settings mirrored my own inner landscapes. Haven't we all wandered through chambers built from the past, or lost ourselves in mirror-like confusion, unsure of who we really are? The symbolism makes the horror more intimate. It's not about spectacle, it's about recognition. The theme of survival also pulses through the narrative, but not in the simple sense of staying alive. It's survival of self, survival of identity. Characters face not just physical annihilation but erasure, of memory, of meaning. Their fight isn't only against death, but against becoming unremembered, unanchored. That feels painfully human to me. Isn't that what we all want, in the quiet hours? To be remembered, to matter, to leave something of ourselves behind in the bloodlines of others? Symbols of time recur, 2 clocks, hourglasses dripping water. Each reminds us of inevitability, but also of endurance. Time doesn't just kill, it reveals. It forces characters to face truths they might otherwise bury. One sequence involving an antique clock, the hands spinning backwards after a near-death escape, still lingers in my mind. It was more than eerie. It was symbolic of how trying to cheat death unravels the natural order, twisting time itself into something uncanny. Even silence becomes symbolic. After particularly intense deaths, there are often moments where the soundtrack falls utterly quiet. No score, no dialogue, just emptiness. Those silences aren't